Obviously, I've actually got the timeline a little bit off here, but I'm not trying to make it like all chronological. It was just before this that you'd also joined Evil Geniuses, which was like a big blockbuster move at the time. There's two angles I wanted to ask about with this. One is obviously they played up like a motherfucker because it's great marketing. The whole like IdrA and HuK have finally like joined together or whatever, you know, and everyone knows the history your dad with the whole like hallucinated army. And like, as you said earlier, look, let's be real. If you were anyone except like 3 Westerners, you're just not allowed to beat IdrA. Otherwise, you are his mortal enemy. Whether you're his mortal enemy or not, he will consider you as much. That's just, he's had a very intense personality, right? On that angle itself, how much of that was just marketing or just things on stage? Like, was he actually realistically, was he actually like an enemy before he knew you were joining AG? They tried to even play up the angle of like, oh, like I had to ask his permission before we could recruit HuK or some shit like that. Was any of that real?
So that like asking IdrA, I don't know. It's totally possible knowing Alex Garfield and IdrA's dynamic. I honestly don't know. It's possibly true because IdrA was still, I think at that time, a bigger draw, bigger star in a lot of ways, streaming numbers, other things that are important to an organization. So I think it's plausible. On him disliking / hating me, I think if you asked any pro from that era, there's two Greg Fields, right? There's the in-game IdrA, who is just a complete asshole, who could be sitting, you could be living with him, and he's 10 feet from you, and he's going to say some very derogative things if he loses to you, especially if he loses to you in a way that he wish he didn't, like in cheese or whatever, right? Sure. And then there's, Greg Fields that you're hanging out with, going to the movies or dinner with, and he's like pretty chill, nice, after parties, whatever it is, he's totally fine. I do think he had a little bit more of an edge to me than some other pros. I mean, we're both kind of like the North American top pro players, right? There is that extra layer of like, this is the guy that is actually competing for my number 1 spot. But I still think like to this day, back then, whatever, if we're hanging out after an event at an after party, or we're at the EG house and we're going to get dinner, there's no issues. Now there are there's quite a few stories about like having a rough time, when matches are tight or whatever it is. But I think every pro would say some version of that, like in game, out of game, 2 different people.
I think you even had some hilarious angle you did in like an interview. I think it was like a Hotbin interview where you just made it that you sound like, I got this new guy in my life, he's a bit intense. You had a pretty good angle on it. It seemed like by the way, it seemed also like, to be fair, compared to a lot of other pros, you also seemed like you sort of knew how to approach him and how to sort of win him over. Is that accurate? Yeah,
I mean, I think even to this day, like if I meet someone, in a friend circle who's like super introverted, but they're nice, but they need a little push to help come out of their shell. Like I'll joke with them a little bit more and try to help them with that, right? And Greg was the same thing. Like I tried to make him feel comfortable, have a good time. When he's having a tough time, be a little bit more sensitive. Obviously, there's a lot of people who are like, oh, he seems a little aggravated, I'm gonna intentionally push his buttons a little bit more. There's that too. But yeah, I mean, I think like, if I messaged him today or whatever and said, "What's up, man?" We'd be totally fine. So.
How would you explain, as someone who knew him and even played against him, how would you explain his competitive mindset? Because I feel like, unfortunately, as you say, there was such a strong, distinct on-camera personality that people he's one of the most divisive figures ever, because people either loved him and sort of rocked with it, almost sometimes on a villain tip, or they just despised him. And I know famously, for example, like even a lot of the things critics would say, actually, if they knew the context, that's not even a diss. Like, the most famous one, right, is when he was in Brood War, they used to go, "You were just a toilet cleaner for some team." It's like, you idiot. Like, you wouldn't even be allowed in their team. Like everyone who starts in those Brood War teams literally does tasks like clean the toilet, make everyone else's food, clean the... That is just actually, by the way, that's like saying, oh, you got in the Marines, did you? What, do you have to pass all tests and go into what? Yeah, that's what you do, you moron. Like, to say that, you actually don't understand how hard that is. You'd have to be, actually, you couldn't be a weak... Put it this way, this is what I'm building into. You couldn't be a weak person and go through that. Like, the idea that later on he was just mentally weak and he would just collapse in all the matches, like, I don't know what it is. I don't know the guy. So I want to get your take. Like, who is this guy? What was he trying to go for? Again, the other thing people memed on is, oh, it's obvious how he's losing. He just doesn't ever want to go into his cheese. But I got the vibe when I interviewed him and saw interviews he did. He was also one of those guys who was almost like chasing perfection. Like, he thought there was the perfect scaling macro game that could beat every opening or something crazy like that. What do you think of this? Am I exaggerating it?
No, I think you're pretty spot on. So I think, he definitely bought into that like Korean mindset that you can play perfectly and you can win every match, right? And you might never achieve that, but that is the best thing to strive towards, to be the best player. Obviously very different than my perspective. And I mean, yeah, like I think people, he deserves a lot of respect for the time he spent in Korea in Brood War. Like it's exactly like that. Like if you're a B teamer, if you're trying to join the team, you're spending a good amount of your day doing those types of chores, and then you're practicing with the A team, and you're that practice dummy, and you're doing what they say, and then maybe you get some time to practice on your own. But it's kind of you got to prove it. And for a Westerner to come in and do that in a Korean team and be the only Westerner doing that is way harder, right? Like for me at Team Liquid OGS, like having a few Western friends to hang out with, talk with, whatever it might be, is a huge difference maker than being the only Westerner there. It's extremely lonely, right? The amount of pressure, loneliness, friends, family, everything, you really cannot explain it unless you have done something like that, right? And it might be, like you said, something compared to the military. It might be, traveling to another country, being in jail. Like there's just, it's a very tough thing to do. And I think, yeah, like he deserves a lot of respect for that. I think, obviously he was very dedicated and he had certain viewpoints, and, there was like some anger there and frustration. But I think even outside of the game to this day, like he's a really smart guy. I don't remember what field it is, but it's like biochemistry technician or whatever. Sure. He's pretty successful, still driven, a much happier person, I imagine, outside of competing and all that pressure that comes with it.
Want to see more cool, funny, interesting clips based on topics from my content? Well, subscribe to this channel then, or, be a pleb and don't.